I am 88 years old. I lost 33 pounds. But the number that actually matters is 62. That is my resting heart rate today, down from 84 when I was taking it easy in a wingback chair. Last week, I spent 4 hours hauling river stones in my garden, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't calculate how many times I had to stand up before the sun went down. We are taught that aging is a slow, inevitable surrender to gravity, a biological tax we pay by slowly disappearing into the furniture. I spent years believing my stiffness was a medical mandate, not a choice, but I discovered a quiet physical truth. My body wasn't rusting because it was old. It was rusting because I had stopped moving the gears. I am not here to offer you a miracle or a polished promise. I am here as one man who decided that his best years weren't a memory, but a daily practice. Stay with me for a moment. If you are also tired of being written off by the world, subscribe to join a community of people who chose not to disappear. Leave a comment below so I know you're still here, still moving, and still refusing to be still. The fabric always smelled like a mix of old dust and cedar and that faint, sharp scent of peppermint tea I'd drink to settle my stomach. I'd sit in that wingback chair for hours, 6, maybe 7 hours at a stretch. Sometimes I'd realize the sun had moved from one side of the rug to the other, and I hadn't moved an inch. It wasn't just that I was tired, it was tactical. I'm a civil engineer by trade, or I was, for 40 years. I spent my life calculating loads, stresses, and the way gravity eventually wins against everything we build. And sitting there, at 88 years old, I'd started applying those same laws to my own bones. I was planning my entire day around the fewest number of times I'd have to stand up. Think about that for a second. If I needed a glass of water, I'd wait. I'd wait until I also needed to use the restroom, or until the mail arrived, so I could justify the load of standing up. I'd calculate the trip, kitchen, then hallway, then back to the chair. 1 trip, minimum output. I told myself I was being efficient, but I was really just hiding from the weight of my own body. 218 pounds. That was the number on the scale that Tuesday afternoon. 218 pounds of stillness. I'd look at my legs, and they didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. They felt like pillars of wet clay, soft, unreliable. When I did finally heave myself up, there was always that noise. You know the one. That involuntary hup, or the long, low groan that leaks out when you shift your weight. I wasn't even aware I was doing it until my daughter pointed it out. Every time I reached for the remote, every time I adjusted my hips, hup. Like I was trying to jump a hurdle just to get to the volume button. And the noises from inside weren't any better. My left knee, it had this specific, dry click every time I took a step. It sounded like a dead branch snapping in the woods. Click, click. I'd listen to it, and I'd think, I'm becoming a collection of noises instead of a man. I had 3 different pillows scattered around the house. 1 for the chair, 1 for the car, 1 for the bed. Lumbar support, wedge pillows, memory foam. I was living in a world of padding. I moved like I was made of thin glass, terrified that if I turned too quickly, something vital would just shatter. I'd accepted it. That was the thing. I'd completely surrendered to the idea that this was the natural, invisible stage of life. You stop being a person who does things, and you start being a person who watches things being done. I remember the elevator. I live in a place where I only have to go up 1 floor to get to the main lobby. Just 1. 12 steps, maybe 14. I'd stand there, staring at those stairs, and it felt like I was looking at the side of Mount Everest. I didn't even consider them. My hand would just drift to that elevator button like it was magnetized. The elevator car had this mirror in it. I hated that mirror. It had this cold, clinical hum, and the lighting it made my skin look like gray parchment. I'd stand there, looking at my shoes, avoiding my own eyes. I told myself it was conservation of energy. I'm 88, right? I should be saving what I have left. My daily step count. I remember checking my phone once. 742 steps for the whole day. Most of that was just pacing the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to whistle. My world had shrunk. It was the distance between the bed and the television. That was my kingdom. I moved through it like a ghost, quiet and heavy. I'd see people on the news, people my age, walking in parks or playing with grandkids, and I'd just think, well, they're the lucky ones. Their bridges haven't collapsed yet. I was waiting. Honestly, I was just waiting for the inevitable. I'd surrendered my biology to the calendar. I was rusting, and I'd convinced myself that rust was just a different kind of finish. But then it was something small. So small, I almost didn't notice it. I was sitting there in the quiet of the afternoon, and I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. I tried to make a fist. Just a simple, tight fist. And for a split second, my fingers didn't want to close all the way. They felt stiff, sure, but there was this tiny, strange flicker of something else. A pulse? A protest? I looked at that wingback chair, then back at my hand. I felt this sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the draft under the door. It was the first time I wondered if I stayed perfectly still. Was I really conserving myself? Or was I just disappearing? I didn't move, not yet. But for the first time in 10 years, I didn't reach for the remote to drown out the silence. I just sat there, listening to the house, listening to the click in my knee, and I wondered, what if the gravity wasn't the problem? What if it was the chair? I stayed in that chair for a long time after that thought hit me, just staring at my shoes. They were these old black Oxfords I only wore for Sunday dinner or the occasional wake. They looked like two heavy leather anchors sitting there on the rug, waiting for someone with the strength to move them. I'm a civil engineer by trade, or I was for 40-some years. I spent my life calculating loads, stresses, and the way gravity eventually wins against every structure we build. And sitting there at 88 years old, I'd started applying those same laws to my own bones. I was planning my entire day around the fewest number of times I'd have to stand up. But that morning, I decided I was going to put those shoes on. I was going to go to the kitchen and make a proper breakfast. I remember leaning forward to reach the laces. Just a simple bend at the waist, right? But my body didn't bend. It folded, like a rusted hinge that hadn't seen oil since the turn of the century. I felt the heat start climbing up the back of my neck. My stomach felt like it was pushing up into my lungs, stealing the air before I could even take a deep breath. I had to stop. I had to sit back up and just pant. I was breathless from tying my shoes. Think about that. I caught myself in the hallway mirror on the way out. I looked old. Not distinguished old. I looked like a machine that had been left out in the rain for 30 years. My face was this angry shade of red, and my eyes looked startled, like I didn't recognize the man staring back. I'm an engineer, I know when a structure is failing. I saw a man who had let his waistline expand by 2 inches in a single year, and I realized I wasn't just aging. I was letting the most important project of my life fall into total, irreversible disrepair. A few days later, I tried to walk to the mailbox. It's maybe 50 yards from the front door. A light breeze was blowing, nothing special. But halfway there, my heart started doing this frantic, rhythmic thumping against my ribs, like a bird trapped in a shoebox, desperate to get out. I reached the box, gripped the cold metal post for support, and I tasted it. That metallic copper taste in the back of my throat you get when you've pushed yourself way too far. From 50 yards. I looked back at the house, and for the first time in my life, the front porch looked like a fortress I couldn't storm. I felt vulnerable. Truly vulnerable. At 88, the world was starting to look like a series of obstacles I could no longer clear. I went back inside, sat on the edge of the bed, and checked my pulse. 84 beats a minute, and I was just sitting there, perfectly still, doing nothing. My heart was working overtime just to keep a stationary man alive. That was the moment the denial finally cracked. You can tell yourself a lot of lies when you're sitting in a comfortable wingback chair. You can call it wisdom, or taking it easy, or conservation of energy, but you can't argue with a heart that's screaming at you for walking to the end of the driveway. You can't ignore the fact that you're becoming a spectator in your own home. I realized that everyone, the doctors, the neighbors, even the people on the television, they all expect you to quit. They give you permission to rest. They say, "You've earned the rest, Arthur." But they don't tell you that the rest is exactly what's pinning you to that chair. They don't tell you that every time you take the elevator for 1 floor, you are signing another lease on your own limitations. The next morning, I was up at 6. The house was dead quiet. I stood in the kitchen, the linoleum chilly under my slippers. I looked at the box of sugary cereal on the counter. It was easy, it was soft, it was exactly the kind of fuel that keeps a machine running at its lowest possible output. I thought about my bridges. If I'd used substandard steel or poured cheap, aerated concrete, those structures wouldn't still be carrying traffic today. And here I was, fueling my own recovery with dust. I didn't have a miracle solution. I didn't have a grand plan. I just had this quiet, heavy realization that if I wanted to see 89 with any dignity, I couldn't keep being the man who was afraid of his own hallway. I took that box of cereal and put it in the bin. I found a bag of steel-cut oats and a carton of eggs. Simple, real. I looked out the window at the street. It was grey and damp, the kind of morning that usually kept me buried under a blanket until noon. My hand was shaking a little when I reached for the handle of the back door. I wasn't sure if I could even make it around the block. I wasn't sure if my knees would hold, or if that click would turn into a snap. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go back to the chair. Not today. I stood there at the threshold, the cold air hitting my face, and I just waited. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't waiting for the end. I was waiting for the first step, and it felt like the heaviest thing I'd ever tried to lift. I stepped out onto that porch at 6:30 that first Wednesday morning. The air was damp, the kind of cold that usually makes a man my age want to retreat under a wool blanket. My plan was simple. 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes of walking before I touched a single drop of coffee. I didn't even make it to the end of the block before my calves started screaming. It wasn't a sharp pain, it was a dull, heavy throb, the sound of muscle that hadn't been asked to do anything for a decade, suddenly waking up and protesting. I finished that first walk, came back inside, and I felt like I'd just climbed a mountain. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart thumping against my ribs, and I thought, Arthur, you are a fool. You're 88. Just go back to the chair. But I didn't. The next morning, I did it again. Same 10 minutes, the same route. Past the neighbor's hydrangea bush, over the cracked pavement by the fire hydrant, and back. On day 4, it rained. I stood by the door, looking at my raincoat, and every bone in my body was begging me to stay inside. I went anyway. I smelled the wet pavement and the earth, and for the first time in years, the click in my knee didn't feel like a break. It felt like a gear finally getting some grease. I started doing what I called kitchen counter squats. I'd be waiting for the kettle to boil for my morning oats, and I gripped that granite countertop for dear life. I'd lower myself down, maybe 4 or 5 inches at first. That was all the load my structure could handle. I'd do 5 of those, just 5. My legs would tremble like a bridge in a gale-force wind. It was humbling. Here I was, a man who once oversaw the construction of a 3-mile bypass, struggling to lift my own rear end 5 inches off the ground. And the food that was the hardest part of the engineering. I stopped the processed bread, the sugary boxes, the convenience that was actually just slowing my engine down. I went to the market and bought eggs, spinach, and real butter. No shakes, no powders, no magic anything. Just fuel that looked like food. I'd scramble 2 eggs with a handful of greens every morning. It was boring. It was repetitive. It was exactly what I needed. By week 3, the novelty had worn off. That's the part they don't tell you. The process isn't a montage with music. It's a slog. I'd wake up on a Tuesday, my lower back feeling like it was made of dry wood, and I'd wonder why I was bothering. The scale hadn't moved much. I still felt heavy. I still felt 88. I remember week 6 vividly. 42 days without missing a walk. 42 days of 5 squats every single morning. I was standing in the kitchen, the steam from the kettle rising in the early light, and I realized I hadn't made that hup sound in 3 days. I'd just stood up, without a groan, without a calculation. It was a Tuesday, the same day of the week I'd seen that 218-pound number that started all of this. I walked to the end of the driveway to get the paper, and I realized I wasn't looking at my feet anymore. I was looking at the horizon. I was breathing through my nose, steady and slow, and that metallic taste in my throat. It was gone. It wasn't a miracle. It was just maintenance. I'd spent 42 days tightening the bolts, clearing the rust, and making sure the alignment was true. I wasn't a new man yet, not by a long shot. But I was a man who was back on the job. I came back inside and stood by the hallway mirror. I didn't look away this time. I reached down to tie my shoes, and I did it in one go. I didn't have to stop to catch my breath. I didn't feel my stomach crushing my lungs. I just tied the knot, stood up straight, and looked at myself. There was a light in my eyes I hadn't seen in a decade. It wasn't triumph, not yet. It was just a door, slightly open, a bit of light spilling into a room that had been dark for far too long. I didn't say anything. I just picked up my keys and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't planning my route back to the armchair. I was wondering how far the next block actually was. It was last Saturday. My wife Martha She's been wanting a stone border around the flower beds for 3 years. I'd always had an excuse ready. My back, the heat, the load-bearing reality of an 88-year-old frame. But that morning, I just went out to the shed and grabbed the wheelbarrow. I spent 4 hours out there. Think about that for a second. 4 hours. I was hauling those heavy gray river stones, kneeling in the dirt, digging a shallow trench and setting the alignment. The sun was hot on my neck and the soil was cool and damp under my fingernails. And the strange thing wasn't that I was doing it. The strange thing was that I forgot to be tired. I didn't have a chair nearby. I didn't calculate the trips. I just worked. When the sun started to dip behind the neighbor's oak tree, I stood up, brushed the dust off my knees, and realized I'd been on my feet since lunch. No bone-deep ache, no reaching for the lumbar pillow, just the honest, clean fatigue of a man who'd done a day's work. I walked back inside, and I didn't head for the wingback chair. I walked right past it. That chair, it looks smaller now somehow, like it's lost its power over me. I went to that hallway mirror, the one I used to hate. I stood there and really looked. The inflammation, that puffy redness I'd carried in my face for a decade, it's gone. My jawline is back. I look like the man I remember being before I decided to start slowing down. I stepped on the scale, 185 pounds. I sat there for a minute looking at that number, 185. That was my weight in 1988 when I was 50 years old and still climbing scaffolding on bridge sites. I've lost 33 pounds of, I've lost 33 pounds of resignation. I've shed the identity of the invisible man. It isn't just the weight though, it's the rhythm. I lay in bed that night, the house quiet, and I put my hand over my heart. I used to feel it fluttering or pounding or just struggling, but now it's a slow, steady, powerful beat. I checked it this morning, 62 beats a minute. When I started this, I was at 84 just sitting in the kitchen. My engine is idling at a 30-year low. I'm an engineer. I know that you can't fix a structural failure with a coat of paint. You have to go to the foundation. You have to clear the rust, one bolt at a time. And that's all I did. No miracles, no magic pills or powders, just the walk, just the real food, just the decision to stop being a ghost in my own hallway. I don't manage my day anymore. I don't plan my trips to the kitchen to save my strength. I have strength to spare. The most incredible thing, though, isn't the garden or the scale. It's the way the world looks at me. Last week, I was at the market, and I reached up to grab a heavy bag of flour from the top shelf for a woman who couldn't reach it. She thanked me, and she didn't look at me with that pitying, "Let me help you, Grandpa" look. She just saw a man who was capable. I felt seen. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't an obstacle in the aisle. I was just a neighbor. I'm 88 years old. I know the calendar hasn't changed. I know gravity is still there, waiting. But I'm not digging my own grave with a spoon anymore. I'm not letting the chair swallow my life. I'm looking at you now, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that maybe you're too far gone, or that the rust is too deep, or that the gravity is just too heavy this time. I see you. I was you. I sat in that same quiet, heavy place, watching the sun move across the rug, and wondering where the man I used to be had gone. I can't tell you what to do. I'm just a retired engineer who likes his morning oats and a long walk. But I wanted you to know that the door isn't locked, is just heavy, and sometimes all it takes to open it is the first 10 minutes. That's all I know. I'm 88 and I'm finally standing on my own 2 feet. And for the first time in a very long time, it's a beautiful day to go for a walk.